Right. Hey guys, how you doing? So welcome to the second video of chapter 3. In this video, we're going to take a look specifically at respiration and cellular respiration in cells. Okay, so let's jump into it. Okay, chemical energy. So chemical energy comes in the form of organic molecules. Last time we looked at radiant energy and how plants capture radiant energy in order to produce glucose, which is the main molecule that they use for energy. Okay. Now, in chemical energy, heterotrophs break down the glucose into to make ATP. Yeah. So organic molecules for immediate use is ATP, and what ATP does, it provides an instant energy release. And the thing about ATP is that it cannot be stored, and so your body can't store the ATP. It can only use it. If it wants to store it, it has to use different organic molecules in order to do that. Yeah. So the ones that are rapidly available is the glucose. For short-term storage in animals, glycogen, and then long-term storage in animals is fat. Starch is the plant equivalent for short-term storage. Yeah. So here is sort of a diagram to show the different amounts of energy that each one contains. Yeah. 5 grams of glucose, about 85 kilojoules, whereas 120 grams contains about 2,000 kilojoules in the liver, and then more in the muscles, and then finally 9 kilograms of fat contain over 300,000 kilojoules of energy. Okay. Okay, let's take a look at ATP. ATP, in terms of structure, it contains 3 components. You've got an adenine group that is represented by this blue diagram up in the corner here, and then you've got a ribose, which is a type of carbohydrate sitting in the middle, and then you've got 3 phosphate groups attached to that. You can see one there, and one there. Okay. Now the thing about ATP is that the 3 phosphate groups are highly energized. So what that means is in a reaction with water, that last phosphate group, this one here, breaks off very easily and releases water and a burst of energy in the process, and we call that hydrolysis. Yeah, the word hydro meaning water and lysis meaning to release. And so hydrolysis is the breakdown of ATP in water to produce ADP, adenosine diphosphate, di meaning 2, and the release of energy in the process. Yeah, and so your formula looks a little bit like this. ATP, when in water, will break down into ADP with organic phosphate. There's that last organic phosphate there, and then the burst of energy there. Okay, so here it is again, and you can sort of see the little burst of energy coming out at the end. Yeah, and that is called hydrolysis. Now, because ATP can't be stored, we use glucose as the main kind of molecule that gets transported around the blood and then used by cells to supply the ATP that organisms need. Yeah, and so for short-term storage, if you don't use that glucose within a certain period of time, it gets converted into a different molecule. In plants, that is starch, the stuff in your potatoes, and in animals, that is glycogen. Yeah, so these molecules are called polysaccharides. The word poly meaning many and saccharum meaning sugar, because there are many sugar molecules that have been joined together and used for storage. So in humans, glycogen is stored mainly in the liver and the muscles. There's more in the muscles than the liver, because what happens is when blood glucose level drops too low, glycogen is then broken down in order to produce glucose and then released into the bloodstream, bringing your blood sugar level back up. Yeah, and this is regulated by a particular hormone called glucagon, which regulates the process. It stops the blood sugar level from dropping too low, and you can probably try and see if you can guess which hormone is the one that's responsible for bringing that level back down. Okay. Okay, long-term storage. So long-term storage, fats are often used. Fats are made up of 1 glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acid chain, as we looked at in the previous chapter. And it contains the largest any store of the organic molecules. About 9 kilograms will store about 300,000 kilojoules of energy, which equates to roughly about 150 Big Macs. Okay, so we store fats in the adipose tissue underneath your skin and around your organs. Here is a diagram of a cell that contains the fat storages, and you can sort of see represented in the orange there, these big vats located in the cell, and then that little corner there is just the nucleus. Yeah, here's the molecule structure. There's the glycerol, and then your 3 fatty acid chains, which can all be the same or can all be different depending on the type of molecule we're talking about. Okay, so the flowchart sort of shows how our body uses ATP, and then it converts into glucose, fats, and then glycogen, and back and forth, and things like that. Okay, so in plants, it's photosynthesis will produce the glucose out of carbon dioxide and water with the help of sunlight. In animals, however, we obtain our glucose or our carbohydrates from the food that we eat as the main source. Either way, you end up with a source of glucose in the organism. If the organism uses that glucose, it is broken down and transferred into ATP, which is immediately used by your cells. If the glucose is unused for a period of time, and then it will get converted into glycogen in animals or starch in plants, which forms a short-term energy store, which then gets broken down back into glucose when it's needed. Long-term storage, it gets converted into fats, which it is then stored and then broken back down again when needed. Yeah, so you can sort of see that your body has a system to store the energy that it obtains from the food that you eat, whether that be short-term for immediate, or long-term or immediate use. Okay. All right, we're going to take a look at the process of cellular respiration. Respiration or cellular respiration is the process of changing oxygen and glucose into carbon dioxide and water. Yeah, it transfers the energy from glucose into ATP. Your body produces ATP by using up the glucose that it obtains from your food, right? Which is why you need glucose in your food, and ATP being the currency that your body uses for the energy for all the activities that it does in the cells. Okay, it pretty much occurs all the time in your cells, and here is a kind of diagram showing all of the different things you will use or need ATP for, ranging from your nervous system, digestive system, muscle contractions. Basically, everything you do requires ATP. Okay, now in cellular respiration, there are two main types. The first one is called aerobic respiration. Aerobic meaning that it requires oxygen in order to generate the ATP. And then there's anaerobic respiration, which means it doesn't require it doesn't require oxygen in order to generate ATP. Yeah, and we're going to take a look at both processes. Okay, aerobic respiration, so the production of ATP from the breakdown of glucose and oxygen to form carbon dioxide and water. So if you look there immediately, hopefully you'll be able to recognize this particular chemical formula being the reverse of photosynthesis, because in photosynthesis, you have water and carbon dioxide producing glucose and oxygen. Aerobic respiration is the reverse process where you break down glucose and oxygen to form your inorganic carbon dioxide and water. Okay, the process is exergonic, means it releases energy, which is pretty useful because you need that energy that's being released, right? And it will produce around about 34 molecules of ATP for every molecule of glucose that you consume. Yeah. As with all systems, it's not 100% efficient, so 40% of the energy from the glucose is converted to ATP, but most of it is actually lost as heat. 60% around about is lost as heat, which is not so bad for us because we're endothermic animals and we actually use that heat as a way of keeping or regulating our body temperature and maintaining homeostasis, which you will look at in another chapter. Okay, there's a three-step process for aerobic respiration: glycolysis, which is also present in anaerobic respiration. Number two, the Kreb cycle, and the third one, the electron transport chain, or simply known as the electron transport. Okay. Now you will need to know all three of these processes in quite a bit of detail, and so just making sure that you guys keep track of the outcomes and the products that are sort of happening in each one. Okay. Here is the chemical equation for it again. You can see there, glucose, 1 molecule of glucose, C6H12O6, plus 6 molecules of O2. Oxygen will produce 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water. And in the process, adenosine diphosphate and organic phosphate will be loaded together to form adenosine triphosphate, which our cells can readily use to perform their functions. Okay. Okay, let's start with step one, glycolysis. Yeah, the word glyco meaning sugar, and lysis once again means release. So in this step, you've got one glucose molecule, C6H12O6, broken down into 2 pyruvate molecules, C3H4O3. Yeah, in glycolysis, the process at the moment doesn't require oxygen. Oxygen is actually used in the next 2 phases, and so glycolysis is actually an anaerobic respiration, but it forms the first step in aerobic respiration. It produces 2 ATP, keep track of the number of ATP being produced. It produces 2 ATP, and it occurs in the cytosol, which is the cell fluid, not the mitochondria. Okay, so the pyruvate then gets transported into the mitochondria for step 2. Yeah, so you can sort of see in the diagram there, it occurs in the cytosol. Now, this is particularly useful because for anaerobic respiration, it occurs in the cytosol because many prokaryotic cells do not have mitochondria in order to perform aerobic respiration. And so anaerobic respiration occurs in the cytosol, allowing prokaryotes like bacteria and things like that to still use anaerobic respiration. Okay. Step 2, the Kreb cycle. It was named after a man named Hans Krebs in the 1900s, and it is the breakdown of one pyruvate molecule to produce one ATP, 3 NADH, and 1 FADH2. Now, you might be wondering, what on earth is NADH? It's a very long name that's been shortened down to NADH, and that's all you need to know. Okay, and likewise with FADH2. Okay, it is also known as the citric acid cycle, and it occurs inside the mitochondria. So now we're starting to move from the cytosol into the mitochondria of the cell, and this process in total will produce 2 ATP, 6 NADH, and 2 FADH2 in total. Now, the NADH and FADH2 are kind of your intermediate products. Yeah, they actually are used up later on in the third step in order to generate more ATP. Yeah, and in this particular process, CO2 is also produced. And so your body uses a particular enzyme called acetyl coenzyme A in order to sort of drive the process. And it is like a cycle, quite literally. It goes around several times, and each time it goes up, it loads more NAD to become NADH, and it loads FAD to become FADH2, and then in the process produces carbon dioxide and generates a little bit of ATP as well. Okay. Now the NADH and FADH2 is then used in the third step, which is the electron transport chain. Okay, it is a chain of reaction that begins to use up all of the ingredients that was produced in the Krebs cycle. And so this is where the bulk of your ATP is produced, around about 30 molecules of ATP in this particular stage. Yeah. It also occurs in the mitochondria, and it loads adenosine diphosphate with inorganic phosphate to form adenosine triphosphate, right? And then it uses up all of the remaining NADH and FADH2, and it also uses the oxygen in order to form H2O, which is why the process of cellular respiration requires oxygen, and your body and my body needs oxygen in order to get the energy that we need. Okay, so here's just a simple flow chart. You start with glucose, getting converted into pyruvate in the cytosol, generating 2 ATP, and then it crosses into the mitochondria, and in the mitochondria, the other 32 ATP is then produced, oxygen going into the process and then getting converted into H2O and carbon dioxide. Okay, this little page is just a little summary of the process. So I'm going to go over it again, showing sort of the chemical change that's occurring in each process. Yeah, in glycolysis, one glucose forms 2 pyruvate and 2 ATP, doesn't require oxygen and is therefore anaerobic, and it occurs in the cytosol. In the Krebs cycle, you have 2 pyruvate forming 6 NADH, 2 FADH2, and 2 ATP. Yeah, so right now your ATP counter sits at about 4. This process requires oxygen and occurs in the mitochondria, and therefore can only occur in eukaryotic cells because only eukaryotic cells have the mitochondria. And then in the electron transport chain, the 6 NADH and 2 FADH2 gets converted into 30 ATP. Right, and so your total ATP sits at about 34. Now this number varies in cells. In very efficient, it can go up to 38, but on average it sits at about 30 to 32 ATP per molecule of glucose. Okay. Now rates of respiration actually varies according to demand. So cells have a high energy requirement, will therefore need to undergo aerobic respiration at a higher level. Yeah, and since oxygen is one of the ingredients that goes into it, you can measure the rate of respiration in an organism or in a particular cell based on the amount of oxygen that is being consumed in the process. Yeah, so here's a table showing the different or the various tissues in your body and organs in your body and the amount of oxygen that they will consume. Your muscles at rest will consume about 1 mil for every 100 grams of tissue per minute. Yeah. However, you'll notice that when they start contracting, that is when you start doing exercise and things like that, that number increases up to 50 mils per 100 grams of tissue for every minute. Yeah. Your skin, 0.2, very little. Your liver sits about 2, brain 3, kidneys 5. Your heart muscles at rest because even though it is at rest, it is still beating to keep you alive. It sits at about 8, and when it's going through heavy exercise, can bump all the way up to about 70. Yeah, so being kind of the most strenuous or oxygen demanding organ in your body. Okay, and the rest of your body sits at about 0.2 as well. However, for example, during digestion, the number might increase around about your digestive system because things like your stomach needs to contract in order to churn your food, and so energy is then diverted into those areas as well, and oxygen. Okay. Okay, anaerobic respiration. So in the cases where oxygen is absent, aerobic respiration cannot occur, and so the process needs to be replaced by anaerobic respiration. Okay, so anaerobic respiration is the breakdown of glucose in the absence of oxygen to produce ATP. Now the key thing is that it's not as efficient as aerobic respiration, but it occurs more rapidly because there's less reactions. There's really only one step that's involved in order to supply the ATP, but it doesn't supply anywhere near the amount that aerobic respiration can produce. Okay, so organisms that can only perform anaerobic respiration are what we call obligate anaerobes. Obligate, think about the word obligation, meaning it can only use anaerobic respiration. However, organisms that can perform anaerobic respiration during conditions where oxygen is in shortage is called facultative anaerobes, including us as humans. Yeah. So your obligate anaerobes are the things that have to use anaerobic and cannot use aerobic at all, and your facultative ones have kind of anaerobic respiration as a bit of a backup when there's no oxygen available. Okay. So in animals, when oxygen is absent, for example, during strenuous exercise, when you start jogging, your body can supply the oxygen at a steady rate. However, if you start sprinting, after a certain period of time, your body is unable to actually supply its cells with the oxygen it needs to maintain aerobic respiration, and so you start converting into anaerobic respiration. And what happens is, in anaerobic respiration, the glucose is broken down into your pyruvates and generates to 2 ATP. However, it changes into a different direction and actually then gets further broken down to form lactic acid. Yeah, so the flowchart shows there, glucose forms 2 pyruvate, loads up 2 ATP, and then that 2 pyruvate then gets converted into lactic acid. And the lactic acid, that final product, actually builds up in your muscle cells. That buildup of lactic acid will lower the pH of your muscle cells and prevent them from contracting, and therefore you are unable to sort of maintain, or your muscles are unable to maintain the amount of contractions and the work that it's currently doing, and so it needs to eventually rest. Okay. Now, in the presence of oxygen, when you start breathing and resting, this process is reversed. The lactic acid then gets converted back again, and then your muscles' pH will actually rise back up to its normal level, and then we'll be able to contract and work normally again. Okay, which is the reason why, you know, when you sprint, after a while your muscles will start to cramp, and then you basically have to stop. Yeah. You know, like for example, in a lot of races and sprints and things like that. In the wild, if you think of the world's fastest land animal, the cheetah, you know, because it can run so fast, the muscles need to work really, really hard to maintain the top speed that it is able to reach, which sits at about 100 kilometers per hour. No, sorry, 70 kilometers per hour. However, the cheetah can only maintain it for 100 meters. So after 100 meters, the lactic acid buildup in its muscles is too great. And so basically, for the cheetah, if it doesn't catch its prey within the first 100 meters, it basically is finished, and the prey will escape. Yeah. Anaerobic respiration doesn't just happen in animals; it happens in other organisms as well. For example, in yeast, the pyruvate gets broken down, but instead of forming lactic acid as it does in animals, in yeast it forms ethanol, which is the primary kind of ingredient for alcohol. Yeah, and so the process is actually called alcoholic fermentation, and we use it because we use it to produce the alcohol that we drink, and it also is used to produce the ethanol fuel that we use for our cars and things like that. And on top of that, it's also used for fermentation in bread. So it's what makes your bread actually rise, because that extra product, the carbon dioxide, is what causes the bread to rise. So that's why we put yeast in our bread. Isn't that exciting? Yeah, when you put a fungus into your bread in order to make it rise. Okay, here's a table showing the comparison between aerobic and anaerobic. Yeah, Once again, to summarize, oxygen is not required in anaerobic. However, it is rapid ATP production and can only be sustained in a short period of time. In animals, less efficient and only 2 ATP molecules per molecule of glucose. Yeah, your end products vary depending on which organism is using anaerobic respiration. You produce lactic acid in animals, ethanol and carbon dioxide in yeast, and a few others as well. In aerobic respiration, you need oxygen. It's a slower rate, but can be sustained indefinitely so long as you have oxygen and glucose available. It is much more efficient, sitting at about 34 ATP molecules, and the end product is carbon dioxide and water for all organisms. Okay. This final slide just simply shows the kind of the relationship that chloroplasts and mitochondria often have with one another, that the products become the ingredients of each other, and therefore plants have a dependency on animals, and animals therefore have a dependency on plants, and so forth. Okay, so that's it for chapter 3. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll see you guys next time.